It's a really exciting time in England. From November this year, development will be mandated to achieve biodiversity net gain. So it's an important question, does this work for the railways, let alone any development? Well, let's have a look at this. So when we build, design, and maintain our infrastructure, it's going to be a sea change. No longer does the law just require us to minimize and mitigate the damage. The law requires us to do our development, design it, build it, and maintain it in ways that achieve a net gain for biodiversity. And that is a big change. The wording in the law is pretty simple. The biodiversity value of the on-site habitat is at least 10% higher. So there's a couple of things to unpack there. Biodiversity value, what's that and how do we measure that? Because we need to measure it, so at least 10% higher. But it gives us a clue about what this is all about, on-site habitat. We're not saying that we can put a single number on nature. We're not saying that we can try and understand the complexities of biodiversity. What we're saying in legal terms, when it comes to development, we can look at our habitats and find a way to measure the biodiversity value so it's at least 10% higher. So that's the question, isn't it? How do we measure this? How are we going to measure biodiversity net gain? Our statutory regulators, Natural England, have decided on a biodiversity metric, and it's free to download at the moment. It's version 3.1. We're expecting the statutory metric to come out very shortly. And it is about habitats, the data. We talked a lot about data today. You collect various different aspects of data. That's a small screenshot of the data there, and the metric scores it. It scores it to produce habitat units. And then you compare your units before and after development, and you need that 10% higher. And just to give you an illustration about how this works, so we'll have our baseline of a site. We collect data on habitats, we run it through the metric and get the baseline number of those habitat units. We then, as many people have just talked about, apply the mitigation hierarchy, avoiding and minimizing particularly those high value habitats as far as possible. And we are an infrastructure project. At some stage, there will be habitat clearance, but if we're careful, we can minimize the deficit of that habitat clearance to an extent, but then we achieve a net gain, and we achieve it by creating and enhancing wildlife-rich habitats. Now, it's interesting, your 50-year duration, so mandatory biodiversity net gain in England is 30 years, and we want that at least 10% higher. So it's not a single number for biodiversity, it's a proxy. It's about habitats, collecting data on habitats, running it through the metric to give us an idea of getting those wildlife-rich habitats in a stage where for 30 years, we're getting at least 10% more than the original development. So mandatory biodiversity net gain, talking about data, requires data on habitats. Is that enough? Will that make us successful in our bid to achieve a biodiversity net gain? And I can speak to you personally about working on the front line of construction for many, many years, and I can tell you that it won't. We'll fail. If the only thing we think about with biodiversity net gain is biodiversity, it's not enough. And we've already heard before the importance of collaborating with stakeholders. I'm going to bring something new to the discussion. We have to think about this in the round. Just the simple aspects of mandatory biodiversity net gain, while it's just the most exciting moment in England, it's not enough just to think about biodiversity. And it's not enough because we're in a joint biodiversity and climate crisis. The reasons why we fail, the missing data, are the very actions we need to take to make sure that we do indeed succeed when we're aiming for a biodiversity net gain. So my first other data point to go through with you, we have to build in resilience. Over that 30-year duration of mandatory biodiversity net gain, we will have more extreme and more significant weather events. We'll have a change in climate conditions. We can't expect biodiversity to be the same as it is here and now. We spoke this morning about the importance of enabling wildlife to move under climate change and the brilliant way that railways as corridors can help us do that. But we have to design it in. The metric, as much as it's great from Natural England, doesn't do that, so we need to add this piece. Now, in my company, we've developed this. So what we have is a specific site. It might be a biodiversity net gain site that's along the railway. I'll give this location to our brilliant climate resilience team, and they'll run climate modeling data. Now they can run this on a 25 kilometre grid square or a 12 kilometre grid square, depending on where we are, depending on what data we get from the Metropolitan Climate Office, which is based in London. To give you a snapshot of the data that we get, that I get, we'll have all sorts of climate modeling data. So this is just one aspect. I'll have extreme heat, I'll have extreme cold, I'll have average temperatures, I'll have extreme rainfall, I'll have minimum rainfall, I'll even have wind and snow. The data that they can collect for a 25 kilometre is just extraordinary. Now you see there the baseline. So the baseline is between 1981 and 2000. That's when we get really good climate average baseline. And they run it to 2060 to run the climate modeling data, and they run it over 2 emission scenarios. So you can see there the RCP6, that's a medium emission scenario. Let's live in hope. But the RCP 8.5 is a high one. So if you look there, the winter data, So in the baseline, the average temperature was 2.9 degrees Celsius. That was the average winter temperature. Under a medium emission scenario, that average is 4 degrees. Under a high emission scenario, that average goes up to nearly 5 degrees, which basically knocks out any hibernation period for the animals that we're trying to protect. And it will go through spring, summer, and autumn. So the level of data is there. We just have to use it. Now, what we then do is go through the evidence, go through all the literature that's available about how animals and climates will respond under climate change. And we can then get a very site-specific climate resilience built-in adaptive management measures for this. So it is possible, the data's there. Just because the legal mandatory biodiversity net gain is not asking me to do this doesn't mean I don't. So we need to build in climate resilience. And it's interesting, it's not just the direct impact. So winter in 2060, the average temperature will be 5 degrees. It's not just about that. We've run this for Heathland that we were doing, and in the summer in one of those sites, it will be 40 degrees far more frequently than it is now. Now, from the data from what we know, that Heathland will dry out and it will look very patchy. But when the rains come back in winter, it will probably regenerate because the seed bank is in the soil. So the 40 degrees won't kill the heathland. But that 40 degrees means we're more likely to have fire and more intense and more frequent wildfires. And those wildfires will absolutely destroy the soils and destroy the seed bank. So it's the interactions as well. So what do? We put in fire breaks. We build that into the management plan so we are armed and ready. And we give nature a fighting chance. The second point, and the most important point, I think, particularly when it comes to railways, is habitats. They sequester carbon and act as carbon sinks in the landscape. And we know this, right? They're one of our greatest assets in the fight against global climate change. The problem is, and this is specific to England, so it would be fantastic to hear what the experience is elsewhere in other countries, that when we clear habitats to create a railway, and this is one that I was working on, we will do the biodiversity mitigation for that. But we don't measure, the law does not require us to measure that loss of a carbon sink or that decrease in carbon sequestration. So my question is, well, under biodiversity net gain, will it pay that back? Because that is a loss of carbon sinks and that's a loss of carbon sequestration. But again, traditional environmental impact assessments, we will not measure that. We do, and we can. We've developed very practical ways. It's like a brilliant automatic spreadsheet. I can just run the biodiversity metric data through this and it will tell me, no, biodiversity net gain doesn't pay that back. And we've run it and we've run it and we've run it. And most times, because biodiversity net gain in England is a 30-year timeline, that's too short. It's too short for carbon. So we have a crazy situation when biodiversity net gain, mandatory biodiversity net gain, is decreasing carbon sequestration of the habitats. So we need to measure this, we need to understand this. Now, I've given much more information about this. So if anyone's interested, we've produced a paper and a couple of webinars about how we actively have to understand not just the change in habitats from a biodiversity point of view, but will they pay back the carbon debt that we create under that change for biodiversity net gain? But this is important for railways. We often talk about how railways are the net zero of the future. They are the transport, the mode that's going to get us the much better place to get us towards net zero and to get towards fighting climate change. And I've worked with brilliant carbon specialists, and they produce all these carbon calculators that look at the source of carbon emissions from constructions, from material, from waste, from operations. And they can really pinpoint in such a great way what our carbon emissions are when we build that railway and how to reduce them. But I've never found a carbon emission calculator that thinks about habitats. When we build railways, we clear habitats. We will create and enhance habitats to achieve a net gain. But we do, in order to talk about net zero, we do have to measure the impact of that loss of carbon sinks and that loss of carbon sequestration, because otherwise, how do we know? How do we know if railways are truly the net zero that we claim them to be? We can't possibly. So it's time to bring this together. It's time to stop thinking and working in silos with net zero in one box and biodiversity net gain in the other. And the other point as well, that's starting to creep in that we need to guard against. When you work on major infrastructure projects, and I work with some brilliant carbon people, and they often get to a stage when they've reduced the carbon emissions as far as possible. So they've run the carbon calculations and they've swapped concrete for another form, and they've really reduced those carbon emissions. But then they get to a stage when they need to offset those residual emissions. So they look for tree planting. The problem is, if they haven't measured that loss of a carbon sink or decreased carbon sequestration, they're not being fair. They will claim net zero from planting trees, but there's a missing piece to the puzzle. There's a huge missing piece to the puzzle. So we do have to bring this together and make sure that we're not stumbling along blind to do the true impacts that we're having, not just on biodiversity, but also on net zero. And you know what's really interesting is I worked within railways and really thinking about mandatory biodiversity net gain. Railways have such an incredible part to play. They are the corridors that wildlife need under climate change. They really are, because the best thing that we can help wildlife with under climate change is to enable them to move, because they will do. But biodiversity data alone is not enough. And we know that from all the talks this morning about the stakeholders and everything else. But as a railway industry, I think we can really lead the way here, because we do talk about net zero a lot. When you work on these major infrastructure projects, we do tend to work in silos with carbon accounting in one box and biodiversity in another. So let's bridge the gaps here. Let's overcome that. And let's think about everything in the round. And we need to bring together these concepts of net zero, biodiversity net gain, and climate resilience to make sure that when we talk about our railways being sustainable, they truly are. Thank you very much.